The dark of night enveloped a small town somewhere in the heart of Southern America. The street was empty but for the light of a lonely lamppost flickering in the distance. As a police car slowly pulled up to the curb, there was an eerie stillness in the air, amplifying further the tension brewing. Behind the wheel was Sergeant Jack Green, known among his colleagues as Tough Jack, a police officer who took real pleasure in exerting his authority. He believed it was his duty to keep this town in order, though his methods of doing so were highly questionable. Every time he saw fear in the eyes of those he pulled over, he felt one surge of power. He slammed on the brakes, seeing a figure pace slowly across the road. A young black man, looking quite tired from the long day, slowly walked, holding an air of calmness, a plastic bag of groceries tucked under his arm. In the sudden light of the lamplight, his face became visible for a second. Calm, tired, with an air of quietude ill-suited to the situation. Green smirked at the sight of his new prey. He felt the familiar surge of superiority and desire to demonstrate his power. He stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut, the noise echoing through the quiet night street. His arrogant tone, which usually made people tremble, reverberated through the street. "Hey you! Stop! Show me your ID!" he shouted, moving forward, his footsteps sounding heavy and hard, as if every step carried some kind of hidden meaning. The young man stopped and calmly turned to face the officer, calm and a semblance of confidence the officer had not often seen. He slowly drew his wallet, but with the aggression in the officer's gaze decided not to hasten. His movements were cautious, knowing full well the tiniest misstep could cost him his freedom or even his life. "What's the matter, officer?" Amadou asked in an even tone, looking directly into Green's eyes. His gaze wasn't challenging, but in that gaze was a complete lack of fear, and this Green was not used to seeing. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, boy," Green snarled, closing in on Amadou. His smile twisted, something malign in it, a predator closing in on his victim. "And I have every right to know what you're doing here." Amadou smiled barely, but he remained cool. He could feel the officer attempting to make him nervous, to slip up. But Amadou knew this kind of situation and how to prepare for it. He knew he needed to stay composed to avoid giving Green an excuse to behave even more aggressively. "Put the bag on the ground and hands on the hood," the officer yelled as he felt the grip of control over the situation begin to slip. Across his face were streaks of shadows cast by the lamppost, making him look like some kind of angry beast that had lost control of its prey. With a sigh, Amadou slowly placed the bag on the asphalt. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he realized that Green was out to just assert his authority. He moved restrictively as if he measured every step for the next action to avoid further aggression. The officer pulled out handcuffs and, without explaining anything, grabbed his hands roughly, pressing him against the pole by the roadside. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists, leaving bruises that cut painfully into his skin. "Now you'll see what real law means," Green proclaimed proudly as the handcuffs clicked shut. His voice was filled with a ringing mock authority that he made an effort to project at every turn. But he didn't know one thing. Amadou wasn't just a random passerby. He worked for an international human rights organization and had influential connections who wouldn't let such an injustice go unnoticed. Besides, Amadou had a camera in his jacket pocket that had been recording everything for quite a while. He knew that every word, every action of Green was being documented, and that gave him even more confidence. "Officer, I think you're making a big mistake," Amadou calmly told him once Green had finally managed to get him cuffed. His voice wasn't trembling with fear or shaking in anger. "A mistake?" Green scoffed, suddenly beginning to lose his grip, like grains of sand slipping through his fingers. "The only mistake here is you deciding to walk through my neighborhood." Amadou didn't say a word, just smiled quietly. Meanwhile, a group of young people came into the street and crowded around them. Some of them began filming with their phones. At this moment, Green suddenly felt how the appearance of the onlookers had changed everything. He was already no longer an unchallenged master of that instant, but an actor in a repellent performance. And every word, every movement was being recorded on video. "Hey, why are you arresting him?" One of the young men asked, approaching closer, his voice bold, which gave the crowd more confidence. Green was flustered but wouldn't let that show. He certainly felt the authority being slowly undermined in pressure from the witnesses looming over him. "Back off. This is police business," he growled, and gone was that confidence of a while earlier. A tiny tremble, but there it was in his voice. Amadou turned to the youngsters and addressed loudly enough for one and all. "This is an unlawful arrest, and all of you are witnesses that, without cause, I am being detained simply because of the color of my skin. My rights are being violated, and it will not go unanswered." Green felt his heart start racing. The situation was spiraling out of control. People were recording with cameras, and with each passing second, the crowd was growing. In the eyes of the bystanders, he saw outrage and support for Amadou. His confidence was fading, leaving only anxiety. "You're gonna shut up now," Green barked, attempting to grab Amadou by his collar, but Amadou showed complete cool and was unruffled. His eyes did not betray the slightest trace of fear but conveyed the understanding that he was telling the truth. But just then, another police car pulled up. Out stepped Lieutenant Raymond, who knew Green well and the way he liked to push the limits of his authority. He quickly assessed the situation. There was a crowd filming everything, and then there was Amadou, calm and confident, chained to the pole. Raymond knew this could go very badly for the department if it wasn't handled right now. "Jack, what's going on here?" Raymond asked sternly as he approached them. His voice was icy cold, and tension was well relayed into it. Green started mumbling something, but Raymond raised his hand to signal that he was not interested in any excuses. The lieutenant went to Amadou, who quickly checked the handcuffs. He knew straight away that Jack had made a serious blunder and it could cost them dearly. "Release him now," he ordered Green. His voice was firm, with no room for protest. Green looked puzzled but did so. The people gathered around clapped, and Jack felt his face turn beet red. He realized how his entire show of power had gone south and how he became a laughingstock instead of a symbol of authority. Amadou rubbed his wrists as the handcuffs were finally removed, and once again looked at Green with that same calm smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant. But this is not over," he said, looking at Green, who by now resembled a man who had lost his footing. His confidence was gone, leaving only emptiness. Lieutenant Raymond realized this act had repercussions, and he wasn't going to save Green from it. He nodded to Amadou briefly, well aware that such acts would not go unpunished anymore. He knew everything that went down was recorded, and the recording itself was severe enough for a review of Green within the department. After the incident that took place on the dark street, Lieutenant Raymond invited Amadou to the police department to officially take his testimony. He understood that Amadou was not an ordinary passerby, and the calm with which he spoke made it clear that this young man would not remain silent. They went to the department, leaving Green on the street, where he continued to feel the stares of the crowd that had not yet dispersed. The police department seemed bleak. The gray building, poorly lighted, promised only routines that were gruesome. The hallways smelled of old records and newly brewed coffee intermingled with muffled voices of officers. They climbed to the second floor as Lieutenant Raymond led Amadou into an interrogation room. It was a small room with concrete walls, a table in the middle, and 2 chairs. There was nothing on the walls except an old poster outlining the police code of conduct, which was ironic in that particular context. A lamp hung from the ceiling, lighting up very dimly and increasing the tension in the atmosphere. Amadou sat at the table as Raymond started the recorder and put it on the table, recording. The lieutenant took Amadou's statement to the fullest detail. He recounted to them how he was stopped without grounds, how Officer Green exceeded his authority and roughly treated him. He narrated the details in icy clarity. Amadou left out no detail, and Raymond listened as if to make out that everything that boy was telling held weight. Lieutenant Raymond listened attentively to him, scribbling what Amadou said down on his notepad so he would miss no detail. He knew that if this situation was not handled properly, it would automatically blow into a major scandal that could shake the reputation of the whole department. "I understand your situation, mister Amadou," Raymond said when Amadou finished his story. His voice was a bit softer than it had been on the street. He could see that Amadou was an educated man, and his approach to solving the problem was balanced. "You have the right to file an official complaint, and I will personally ensure that this case is properly reviewed." Amadou nodded with a drained face. He knew his actions would have consequences, but he was not acting for revenge. He wanted justice to be restituted and people like Green no longer to have the opportunity to abuse their powers. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I will insist on it," Amadou said coolly but firmly. In the confined room, his words had a significant weight. "I also have a video recording of the entire incident. This is additional evidence that my rights were violated." Raymond frowned but nodded. He understood this case could be used against them if they did not act by the book. He assured Amadou that everything would be forwarded to the Internal Affairs for investigation. After that, Raymond escorted Amadou to the exit of the department, shaking his hand as they parted ways. "I hope that justice will be served," he said as they stood at the door. His eyes were serious, and a commitment to his promise was in them. "And once again, I apologize for the actions of my subordinate." Amadou nodded and left the department. Outside, a few of his colleagues from the Human Rights Organization were already waiting for him. Their faces radiated support and determination. They then surrounded Amadou, asking for details, comforting him and making sure he knew he was not alone with his problem. The calls on his phone would not stop. Friends and colleagues had already learned about the situation and were ready to support him. They spoke about what could be done, scheduled meetings with lawyers and human rights advocates. One thing was written on the faces of these people: they were ready to fight. He also received messages from journalists who wanted to interview him. He knew this was a story that needed to be told so that others would not fear speaking out against an injustice. His face looked calm, but his eyes burned with determination. He knew this wasn't just one of those incidents in his life. This was supposed to change something much greater. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Raymond went back to his office. He knew this case needed investigation, and that Jack Green could not stay unpunished one more day. His behavior was undermining the authority of the whole police force, and Raymond would not be blind to this. He took all the papers concerning the incident and started to write the report. Every word he wrote was deeply thought over. Every detail was accounted for. He knew that he might have trouble with his superiors, but his sense of justice outweighed any career ambitions. He decided to act honestly because he understood that only in this way could he look his subordinates and himself in the eyes. The next morning, the department was abuzz with rumors. The police officers were discussing the previous night's event. Some pitted Green, thinking that he had only overdone things a bit, while some others understood that he had crossed the line. The atmosphere in the department was tense, and everyone felt the turning point of something. Uncertainty and fear of possible changes hung in the air like an ominous cloud. Everyone waited to see how events would develop. Confident the day before, Green now felt pressure closing in on him from every side. His office was dark, except for a single lamp which lighted up the desk covered with documents and notes. He knew he had been wrong, but his pride didn't let him say so. He sat there looking for excuses, and every thought, every argument seemed weak and helpless. He knew he would be brought to account, but this feeling of injustice and the possible consequences haunted him from within. The loss of his job and public humiliation hung over him like the sword of Damocles. At the same time, Amadou had already given an interview to the local newspaper. He sat in a cozy newsroom, a recorder in front of him, while the journalist listened attentively to his every word. Amadou's story was gaining momentum. He spoke about discrimination, how many times people who were unlucky enough to be born with a different skin color became victims of injustice and abuse of power. Strong and poignant words, his reached many hearts. He was talking about changing society, about how it is necessary to provide legal protection to everyone, irrespective of skin color or social position. People started discussing this incident, and soon the story of Amadou became well known, not only within their city limits but far beyond. After the increasing public echo, police leadership reacted. Jack Green was temporarily suspended from his duties pending investigation. This decision received mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some thought he got what he deserved, while others thought it was just a political move to appease the crowd. But all knew this decision was inevitable. Green's image, once confident in his unshakable power, now seemed so dim and uncertain, like a candle about to go out. He felt isolated, knowing that others were starting to avoid him, and this was a new, very unpleasant experience for him. Amadou was not to stop, though he knew that his case could be a good example for many people who suffered injustice. He started working with lawyers and human rights defenders, preparing to file a lawsuit against Green and the police department. He wanted this case to be a precedent for the people and make them realize the significance of fighting for their right. Working night till late, he was studying all documents, preparing materials, and he was determined to take it up to its logical end. One morning, Amadou received a phone call from a woman who introduced herself as the sister of another man who had fallen victim to similar actions by Green. Her voice was shaking, full of bitterness and despair. She cried, telling her story and asking for help. Amadou listened, his heart aching with pain, but at the same time, it only strengthened his determination to continue the fight. He realized that his case was not just his personal story but something much bigger. It was a fight for those who had no voice, for those whose cries for help had been ignored. Later that day, Amadou met with a group of activists. They discussed the strategy for further actions, planned how to make his story known to as wide an audience as possible. Their office was small but full of energy. Posters with human rights slogans hung on the walls, and a table in the corner was piled with leaflets and documents. Everybody who was present was ready to fight for justice, and Amadou felt a part of something important. "We cannot leave such cases unpunished," said one of the activists, a tall man with a thick beard. His voice sounded determined. "We have to show that we won't stay silent." Amadou nodded, his eyes shining with determination. He knew his path would be long and difficult, but he was ready to see it through. He felt the support of these people, and it gave him strength. He realized that fighting for justice was not just a fight for himself, but for every person who had ever experienced injustice. Several weeks had passed since the event, and the events had unfolded quicker than Amadou had been ready for. Interest in his story was growing, which further fed activity across the entire region. Amadou got calls from every kind of media for an interview: television, radio, online publications. He spoke of his case and, at the same time, spoke of the defects in law enforcement that allowed such cases to occur. He tried to point out to the audience that each person's rights should be protected without regard to race, gender, or social status. Amadou's daily schedule turned out to be very busy now. His phone rang all the time. His email was full of messages from supporters, journalists, and even people who needed advice in similar situations. He felt himself on a wave of a massive movement that was exhausting, but at least with real change. At one point, he even got to be invited to speak on human rights at an international forum, a testament that this was a struggle whose reverberations would most likely echo well outside their small town. One of the most striking moments was his invitation to a national television evening program. This was really a breakthrough, because the issue that had long been silenced received nationwide attention. The studio was brightly lit, and the camera focused on Amadou's face, which radiated calm and confidence. The host asked him about the most difficult moments of that night. "The hardest part was not letting emotions take over," Amadou replied, looking straight into the camera. "I wanted that officer to understand that he had no right to treat people that way just because of their skin color. I remained calm because I knew my reaction would determine how this story would unfold." His words struck a chord in the hearts of many viewers. Demonstrations started. People took to the streets, protesting against police brutality and abuse of power. Posters emerged in the squares with slogans such as "Justice for Amadou" and "No to Discrimination." It was more than support, it was a movement growing before their eyes, with Amadou as its symbol. The huge crowds filled the main streets of the city. The energy in the air felt like change. People were singing, holding posters, many bringing their families to show support. A few protesters came up to Amadou, hugged him, thanked him for his courage. He felt part of a big community that no longer feared demanding justice. Meanwhile, back at the police department, things were getting increasingly tense. Lieutenant Raymond watched the atmosphere amongst his colleagues change. Many now started to avoid Jack Green since they felt one man's actions might affect the entire system. Green sat in a remote corner where no one wanted to talk to him, and his office resembled an isolation cell. His reputation was destroyed, and he knew that he could no longer return to the respect he once had among his colleagues. "It's all politics," he grumbled, fidgeting with papers on his desk. "They're just looking for a scapegoat." But he knew it wasn't just politics. It was something more than that. It was justice slowly catching up with him. Sleepless nights, endless days of attempts to find justification that could restore at least some of his former status, all was vain. His colleagues stopped supporting him, and he was left alone with his fears. Once, going out from the department, Green caught his vision at the building's doorway, standing a group of protesters, shouting slogan noises, shouting against police violence, and among them stood Amadou. He then glances to meet his vision without one speck of anger inside of it, rather determination. His heart turns serious. He no more stands having power over them. Power had shifted to the ones who fight for justice, and it was a new and frightening feeling that he was having. Amadou did not stay still. He continued to meet with activists, lawyers, and people who sought change. They formed an initiative group to fight police violence, began collecting signatures to demand an independent investigation into police actions. His story became a catalyst for many other victims of police abuse who began to come forward with their own stories. Every meeting with activists opened new tests. They sat in small rooms, lined with leaflets, posters, and papers, discussing strategies, events, and actions. Amadou learned every day. He learned about legal nuances, about rights that very often stayed only on paper but were not realized. It gave him strength because he knew that now he had means to struggle not only on the streets but in the field of law as well. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Amadou came back home. He lived in a small apartment in a high-rise building on the outskirts of the city. The apartment was modest but cozy. A cup of unfinished coffee sat on the table, and photos from his travels hung on the walls, memories of better times when he worked on international missions. Amadou sat on the couch and closed his eyes for a moment. Fatigue was building up, but he felt satisfied. He knew that the fight was just beginning, but it was worth it. He remembered the faces of all those he had met over the past few weeks, young activists inspired by his story, mothers who came to him with stories of their children who had fallen victim to police abuse, lawyers offering their help for free. Amadou realized that his struggle had taken on a much broader significance than he could ever have imagined. He was not just a person seeking justice for himself. He had become the voice of many who could not speak. Meanwhile, city council meetings on local police reform began. Officials understood that the public pressure was too great to be ignored. They considered introducing independent oversight of police activities and in-service training on human rights for officers. These measures can be the first step towards restoring citizens' trust in law enforcement. Lieutenant Raymond was a participant in those meetings. He wanted reform, as one clearly could understand that the system wouldn't work if it did not reform. His voice resonated with commitment and professionalism. He tried to convince his colleagues that changes were necessary if they ever wanted people to trust them again. Raymond knew it wouldn't be easy, yet he thought it was feasible. Each meeting was tough. Most of his colleagues resisted change, fearing to lose their power, their privileges. Some said it was just temporary pressure and that everything would revert to how it was. But Raymond knew this time it was different. He saw the determination in the eyes of the people who came to the squares, determination that could not be broken. A few days after one such meeting, Raymond decided to meet with Amadou. He knew they wanted the same thing, justice. They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the corner of the street. Upon arriving, Raymond found Amadou already seated at a table by the window, watching people pass by. "Good to see you, Lieutenant," Amadou said as Raymond sat down across from him. "I didn't expect you to want to meet in person." "I think we both want the same thing," Raymond replied, looking directly into Amadou's eyes. "I want the police to be what it should be, and I want you to know that I'm on your side." Amadou nodded. He felt that Raymond was being serious. Their conversation lasted several hours into the night. They had discussed possible paths to change and the ways to join forces in pursuing justice. Raymond was willing to provide all the support inside the system, while Amadou continued from the outside. This meeting marked the beginning of their joint cooperation. Both knew that the struggle would be long and exhausting, but each of them was ready to see it through to the end. For Amadou, finding an ally in the form of a police officer was an important step forward. He knew that change was only possible when people within the system were also willing to make those changes. Their collaborative work began with small steps. Raymond started organizing meetings with other police officers where they would discuss the importance of behaving with ethical standards and being responsible to society. Meanwhile, Amadou worked on organizing mass actions and meetings with communities to bring forth the message of change. They knew it would take time, but with each new conversation and with each new face they met along the way, their belief in change grew even stronger.